It was a Sunday morning in Shanghai when the world changed. Not in a marble diplomatic hall, not over a handshake between generals. It changed inside a basement trading room where a man in a gray suit stared at a screen showing gold trading at $6,000 an ounce. He blinked. He refreshed the page. The number did not move. $6,000. He picked up the phone and spoke 4 words to his colleague. Open everything we have. Most people watching the news that morning believed this was a war story. Missiles, drones, burning ships, and shattered alliances. That is what every screen in every language showed you. But the people who actually move the world's money were not watching missile counts. They were watching the ledger. The ledger was screaming something the cameras could not capture. It was screaming that the global financial architecture, built on paper promises and petrodollar faith, was fracturing in real time. This was not a war story. This was a bankruptcy story wearing a war's costume. Let that land for a second. Every major collapse in modern history looked like a political or military event on the surface. The fall of the Ottoman Empire, the Weimar Republic's death spiral, Argentina's frozen bank accounts, the Soviet Union's quiet financial implosion. Every single one of them had a military face. But underneath, there was always a ledger. And that ledger always told the truth, long before the politicians did. Tonight, we open that ledger. Imagine the Persian Gulf just 18 months before this weekend. Oil tankers moved like slow giants through the Strait of Hormuz, carrying 20 million barrels of crude every single day. The sky above Dubai shimmered with the heat rising from 1,000 construction cranes. Jebel Ali, the largest port in the Middle East, processed 60% of all UAE imports without a single missed shipment. Saudi Arabia was pumping. Qatar was liquefying its gas into gold. The global energy machine was running at full, roaring throttle. The world ran on this oil. Every plastic bottle, every jet flight, every military vehicle on every continent was powered by liquid flowing through this single, irreplaceable waterway. 20 miles wide at its narrowest point. 20 miles of water that carried 20% of all global seaborne crude. If you wanted to strangle the modern industrial economy, this was the throat to grip. Iran sat at the edge of this empire of energy like a wounded predator. Tehran's grand bazaars still hummed with gold merchants and spice traders, a civilization that predated Western banking by 3,000 years. The Revolutionary Guards controlled the most sophisticated missile arsenal in the entire region. Iran had proxies operating from Yemen to Lebanon, from Iraq to Syria. On the surface, this was a nation with leverage, with reach, with the demonstrated ability to hold the global energy supply chain hostage at will. They looked formidable. They looked untouchable. They looked like they held every card in the deck. But beneath the surface, the foundation was rotting. The real story was not about missiles or martyrdom or political ideology. The real story was what happens when a nation's entire economic model depends on one commodity, one waterway, and a price it cannot set or control. The real story was what happens when the ledger fills with deficits, when sanctions bleed the banking system white, and when the national currency loses 70% of its purchasing power in 5 years. Iran was not the aggressor in a military drama. Iran was a debt-strangled, inflation-crushed nation, making a final, desperate economic gamble. Here is the trap nobody ever discusses plainly. Iran's economy had been under US-led sanctions for decades. Those sanctions did not simply block oil sales. They severed Iran from the SWIFT banking system, the invisible financial nervous system that connects every major bank on Earth. Imagine cutting every artery in a body, and then being surprised when the organs begin failing. That is what sanctions do. They do not kill quickly. They kill slowly, systematically, and they always destroy the ordinary citizen before they ever touch the regime. By the time military conflict fully escalated, Iran's oil revenues had collapsed from over $100 billion annually to below $40 billion. Think about what that number means. A 60% income collapse. For any government trying to fund a military, pay civil servants, subsidize fuel, and maintain social stability simultaneously, that is not a budget problem. That is an economic amputation with no anesthetic. The living monster in this story is not the Iranian Air Force. The living monster is the structural deficit. The Iranian government had been spending more than it earned for year after consecutive year, printing rallies to cover the gap, and watching that printed money devour the savings of its own people like acid. Inflation had crossed 40%. The real had become a source of national shame. Workers earning wages in reals were effectively being paid in tissue paper that dissolved a little more each week. The middle class was bleeding out slowly in silence, and the regime understood precisely what that meant for its long-term survival. The true antagonist in this story wears no uniform and carries no weapon. The antagonist is the oil market itself. Specifically, it is the mechanism by which oil prices are not set in Tehran, not in Riyadh, but on trading floors in Chicago and London, by analysts who have never felt crude oil on their hands. When Brent crude sat below $80 per barrel, Iran's national budget bled openly. Every single dollar below their fiscal break-even price of $90 per barrel was a dollar they had to borrow, print, or steal from the next generation's future. The oil market was slowly strangling the Islamic Republic, and the regime had exactly one move remaining: control the choke point. Make Hormuz unnavigable. Make the oil market fear them more than it ignored them. This is where the timeline becomes a downward spiral. By the time US-Israeli airstrikes confirmed the deaths of Iran's supreme leadership, financial markets across every continent were already operating in low-level crisis mode. Gold had been closing at new records for 7 consecutive months. Silver lease rates had been spiking for 6 consecutive trading days before the weekend. The Shanghai-London gold premium had been persistently wide at $12 an ounce, a quiet, insistent signal that Asian physical buyers were accumulating metal urgently in ways that Western paper markets were choosing not to acknowledge. Then the strikes happened, and everything accelerated simultaneously, like multiple fuses igniting from a single spark. Iran launched 165 ballistic missiles, 2 cruise missiles, and 541 drones in one coordinated response package. 541 drones. Let that number sit with you. Each one represents a manufacturing cost, a fuel cost, a decision made by a human being in a command center to permanently expend a resource. This was not deterrence. This was a nation burning through its strategic reserves in one single, irreversible statement of desperation. 152 ballistic missiles were intercepted. 56 drones were destroyed in flight, but 35 drones hit land. 21 struck civilian targets in a single morning. The UAE, the financial hub of the entire Gulf region, was turned into a war zone between one sunrise and the next. 3 people killed, 58 injured, representing dozens of nationalities. Moderate damage to civilian homes and property on the surface. But the real damage was invisible to any camera. The real damage was happening in the insurance markets, in the risk models, in the actuarial spreadsheets of shipping companies around the world. Here is the number that fractured everything. Before the weekend, war risk insurance for a $100 million oil tanker cost approximately $250,000 per voyage through Hormuz. Within 48 hours, that number jumped to $375,000, a 50% increase in 2 days. Ships do not run on courage or patriotism or political will. Ships run on insurance coverage. When that coverage becomes unaffordable or simply unavailable because no underwriter will write the policy, ships stop moving. Full stop. That is not a metaphor. That is the precise mechanism by which an economic blockade forms without a single naval mine being laid. 150 tankers dropped anchor in open water. Oil and LNG carriers sitting stationary off the coasts of Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Kuwait, and the UAE, refusing to move 1 nautical mile forward. Maersk, the world's largest shipping line, suspended all Strait of Hormuz transits. Brent crude began trading up 8 to 10%, pushing past $80 per barrel and holding. The weekend prices did not retreat. They did not give back their gains. This is what a violent negative supply shock looks like when it is happening in real time. This is not a futures market correction. This is the physical world refusing to cooperate with the paper world any longer. And then the dark markets opened their eyes. China's Dashang exchange issued a formal weekend notice. If gold prices deviate significantly and accumulated gold liquidity is depleted, trading will be closed. Read that sentence again slowly. One of China's primary commodity exchanges was pre-announcing a potential trading halt because it anticipated the incoming price move would be too violent for available physical inventory to absorb. That is not routine risk management communication. That is a formal, written admission that the system is already cracking under the weight of what is coming. The dark market for gold, the physical over-the-counter network that operates entirely outside regulated exchanges, touched $6,000 per ounce. Not one, not a converted figure, $6,000 per troy ounce of physical gold. The last known Western spot price before Friday's close was $5,278. That is a $722 gap over a single weekend. PXG, tokenized physical gold on crypto infrastructure, hit $5,600 on Saturday before pulling back to $5,400, still $124 above Friday's Western close. Crypto never sleeps, and the premium ran completely wild while traditional markets sat in the dark. Silver told a more extreme story still. The physical silver buyback price premium between small distributors in Shenzhen shot up by nearly $20 per troy ounce in a single weekend. That placed Shenzhen's physical silver buyback price north of $120 per ounce. Western spot had closed Friday at $93. IG weekend silver was trading near $100. Hyperliquid showed $96. Shanghai spot was at $105. Shanghai futures at $108. That is a $27 gap between China's physical market and Western paper in one weekend. A $27 confession that the paper price was fiction. The smoking gun in this story is not a missile trajectory or a classified intelligence document. The smoking gun is a port map. Specifically, it is the deliberate selection of which ports Iran targeted, and what that selection reveals about an economic warfare doctrine that every military analyst on television completely failed to identify. Iran did not fire at random coordinates. Iran fired at the ports. They hit Duqm in Oman, a port specifically constructed to bypass Hormuz risk as an insurance policy against exactly this scenario. They struck Jebel Ali in Dubai, the port that handles 60% of all UAE imports and anchors the entire non-oil economy of the Emirates. They attacked Mina Salman in Bahrain, the home port of the U.S. Fifth Fleet, the naval force theoretically guaranteeing the safety of Gulf commerce. They hit Haifa in Israel, the port that manages critical energy imports for the nation conducting airstrikes against them. This was the foreclosure notice. This was the moment Iran communicated not to armies or generals, but directly to insurance actuaries, shipping company CFOs, and port terminal directors. The message was simple, surgical, and devastating. There is no safe port anywhere in this theater. There is no alternative route that has not already been targeted. Every crane at Jebel Ali, every fuel terminal at Duqm, every pier at Mina Salman, these are now line items on a balance sheet that Iran can write down to zero at the time of its choosing. Patriot batteries cannot protect industrial port infrastructure from coordinated drone swarms arriving in waves. The defensive math simply does not work. Iran's message, stripped to its brutal arithmetic, was this: you cannot protect everything, and we only need to destroy one thing to make ensuring everything else impossible to calculate. That was the moment the arbitrage became physically impossible to ignore. Physical buyers in Asia were paying $120 for silver. Western paper had closed at $93. That $27 gap was not a trading opportunity for clever arbitrageurs. That gap was a confession written in market prices. It was the physical world formally declaring that it no longer trusted the number printed on a futures contract in Chicago. It was the ledger finally admitting what the news cameras were only beginning to attempt to show. This is the moment the money runs out. Not as metaphor, as arithmetic. Japan relies on 75% of its oil imports flowing through the Strait of Hormuz and is effectively 100% import-dependent on foreign energy. Japanese tankers were already turning back before Monday's open. South Korea receives 60% of its crude through Hormuz. India sources 50% of its crude imports from Gulf states, approximately 2.6 million barrels every single day, plus 60% of its natural gas and LNG supply. India's fuel prices were set to spike immediately. The rupee would face direct currency pressure. GDP growth projections would need emergency revision. These are not analyst forecasts or theoretical scenarios. They are arithmetic certainties when 20 million barrels of daily oil flow freeze solid in place. China, the single largest absolute buyer at 55 to 60% of crude imports via Hormuz, has partial diversification through Russian pipeline infrastructure. But pipelines cannot replace tanker capacity overnight. China still absorbs massive, immediate price pain. Think about the full weight of that picture. The three largest manufacturing economies in Asia simultaneously facing energy supply disruption, simultaneously experiencing currency pressure, simultaneously watching their industrial sectors run emergency logistics calculations. This is not a regional crisis in a distant corner of the world. This is a global economic rupture wearing a regional military uniform. This is where sovereignty finally confronts solvency. Sovereignty is solvency. A nation that cannot fuel its factories, cannot heat its hospitals, cannot power its military, a nation whose entire energy supply can be frozen by a decision made in Tehran, that nation is not truly sovereign. It is merely solvent until the next moment of maximum pressure. Japan, South Korea, India, these are wealthy, sophisticated, capable nations, but their accumulated energy dependency had left them exposed to a 20-mile choke point they could not defend, could not bypass, and could not afford to watch close. The hunger had not arrived yet. The cold had not arrived yet. But the humiliation was already present in every emergency cabinet session convening across Asia that weekend. For Iran, the math cuts the other way. Launching 541 drones isn't symbolic. It's expensive. Estimates suggest $300 to $500 million in assets burned in a single strike package. For a country generating roughly $40 billion in annual oil revenue, already running structural deficits and battling entrenched inflation, that kind of expenditure in 48 hours isn't sustainable strategy. It's escalation under financial strain. History shows peak pressure is never the end. The 1979 oil shock took years to absorb. Gulf War tanker insurance premiums needed years to normalize. Supply chains don't simply snap back. Emergency systems become permanent. The post-crisis world rarely looks like the one before it. The structural metals deficits didn't change by a single ounce this weekend. Silver had already closed green for 10 straight months. Gold was printing its 7th consecutive record high. Lease rates were rising before any missile flew. Industrial demand, from solar, EV batteries, AI infrastructure, 5G networks, military procurement, and nuclear build-outs, never slowed. Mine supply was already lagging. Central banks were buying gold at historic rates. These were tectonic pressures beneath the surface long before headlines caught up. What changed wasn't the foundation, it was the speed. Decades of monetary realignment compressed into days. Shanghai's gold premium jumped sharply. In Shenzhen, physical silver traded far above Western paper prices. That gap isn't noise, it's a signal. Physical markets in Asia are asserting price discovery independent of futures exchanges. The Strait of Hormuz isn't closed by missiles. It's constrained by insurance mathematics. When risk models make voyages uneconomic, ships stay anchored. That same math reprices oil, gold, and silver instantly. This isn't just a war story, it's a balance sheet story. Every crisis has a military face and an economic spine. The spine determines who absorbs the shock and who emerges stronger. The ledger moves first. The headlines follow.